In 1763, as tensions rose across the northern territories, and French trappers pushed deeper into the unmarked forests beyond the St. Lawrence, our small trading band traveled west in search of untouched beaver runs and safer wintering grounds. But as we entered a region where the pines grew impossibly tall and the snow kept strange patterns beneath their boughs, we found signs of something no man in our party could name. And soon enough, we learned the forest held a presence that watched, followed, and pressed upon us with intentions we could not understand. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thank you. I have spent decades trying to find a language suitable for what happened in those months. And even now, as age bends my back in winter, stiffens my hands more each year than the last, the memory remains too vivid to discard as illusion, and too heavy to recount without deliberation. Yet it presses upon me all the same. The events of that winter carved themselves into us like frost into raw timber, and of the 9 men who set out, only 3 lived to see the spring thaw. The others remained somewhere in that northern expanse, their fates unrecorded, except in my memories. The journals I kept then were smeared by wet snow and smoke, the pages stiffened by cold and fear, but enough was preserved to give shape to what I experienced. Even now, I cannot read them without feeling the weight of the dark spruce upon my shoulders. We left Montreal in the late summer of 1763, only months after the treaties reshaped these lands and left men like us dangling between the ambitions of new powers and the lingering tensions of the old. Many trappers had abandoned the interior, fearing raids or the shifting claims of distant governors who cared little for their lives. But the wilderness had always offered its own kind of promise to those who knew how to survive it. The men I traveled with were not dreamers. They were endured by the land as much as they endured it. Hard, capable, quiet men who carried traps, powder, and the certainty that the forest always took as much as it gave. We pushed westward by canoe while the river still ran open, our hulls heavy with salt pork, dried peas, powder, steel traps, blankets, flints, and the trade goods we intended to use with friendly nations along the way. Autumn came early that year. The nights turned sharp before the birches even yellowed. Frost feathered the margins of the river and held our breath in the air as we paddled. The sound of the water against the hull became a kind of heartbeat that steadied us through the long days. The sky carried migrating geese in long, wavering bands, and each morning brought a pale sun that seemed to rise reluctantly between the dark shoulders of the pines. Farther west, the land lifted into stony ridges and long valleys where fog clung low to the ground, turning every hollow into a place where shapes could linger unnoticed. We encountered no settlements after mid-season, only abandoned fishing shacks, a few charred remains of old camps, and the tracks of animals that moved before dawn. At first, we thought little of the odd traces we saw on the riverbanks, deep impressions left in soft mud or newly fallen snow. Some were spaced too far apart for any wolf or caribou, but we had little reason to question them. The wilderness often made prints unclear, softened or stretched by melting frost or shifting runoff. A man could misjudge almost anything if his eyes were tired enough. Still, I remember the way the men paused a moment longer than usual when such marks appeared, as if the shapes embedded in the earth suggested something they were unwilling to name. By the time we reached the first of the inland lakes where we intended to winter, the cold had deepened. Ice formed along the edges of the inlets in the mornings, thin but persistent. We built our camp on a rise overlooking the water, where spruce and fir formed a dense wall behind us, and the shoreline offered just enough openness for us to spot approaching game. The days shortened rapidly, bringing long shadows that stretched across the lake before we had even finished setting our traps. We expected the usual signs of bear, caribou, lynx, and wolf as the season shifted, and at first nothing seemed amiss. But the stillness of the surrounding forest unsettled me from the beginning. It began subtly. a faint unease that settled in the chest without forming a clear thought. The men worked quietly, as trappers do, each accustomed to days of silence broken only by the creak of snowshoes or the thud of an axe. But the woods around us seemed to listen. There were mornings when the air felt unnaturally still, the kind of cold silence that muffled even the groan of ice expanding beneath the lake. At night, when the sky was bright with winter stars, the fire crackled too loudly, its echoes swallowed strangely by the trees. And each morning brought new prints around the far edges of our camp prod, deep and spaced in a way that suggested something large had walked just beyond the reach of our firelight while we slept. We told ourselves they were bear tracks distorted by melting, though the shape seemed all wrong and the distances between the impressions far too long. Some of the men measured their own strides against them. Even the tallest among us could not match the spacing. There was something unsettling in the sheer weight implied by the depth of each mark, carved cleanly through fresh snow to the frozen ground beneath. Yet none of us spoke openly of it. Trappers learn not to give voice to every fear. There are too many in these lands to name them all without inviting madness. Our traps yielded poor results in those first weeks. Beaver dams showed signs of recent activity, but the animals seemed to have moved deeper into the marshes or abandoned their lodges entirely. Even the smaller game proved scarce. Snowshoe hare tracks vanished abruptly into shadowed hollows or ended near trees, marked by long vertical scuff scrapes made by something large brushing the bark. Once, while checking his line of traps before dawn, one of the men returned pale and cold, insisting he had heard something pacing him through the woods. He had seen nothing, but the sound of heavy steps had matched his own, always at a distance of perhaps 30 paces, neither approaching nor falling behind. When he stopped, the steps stopped. When he moved again, they resumed. He said the cadence was deliberate, unhurried, and too heavy to be anything but a man or a large animal. But he had seen no lantern glow, no silhouette, no breath cloud in the cold air. There was nothing but the sound of footfalls blunted by snow. We dismissed it at the time, though uneasily. He was not a man prone to fancy or exaggeration. Still, fatigue often plays tricks on the mind in the dark winter months. A lone trapper walking before sunrise can imagine much. But as the days passed, more men returned with reports of similar experiences, shapes glimpsed between the trees, sounds that followed without revealing themselves, branches shifting beneath a weight too heavy for wind. The forest, once familiar, began to feel foreign. The first carcass we found lay at the base of a ravine where the snow drifted deep. It was a moose, a young bull not yet grown to full size. Its neck was broken cleanly, the head twisted at an unnatural angle. No bite marks showed, no slash of claws. The snow around it bore no sign of struggle or chase, only a single set of immense tracks leading toward the tree line. The men studied them in silence. Each impression was long, broader than a man's hand, with a shape that suggested something like a human foot, but impossibly large. The snow had preserved the details perfectly: the broad heel, the pronounced arch, the splay of toes at the front. No known animal left prints like that. We dragged the carcass back to camp for what meat it could provide, though some men refused to eat from it. They believed the kill unnatural, tainted by some presence that did not belong to the ordinary order of the wilderness. I do not know whether the meat tasted any different. Fear dulls the senses in strange ways. One night, weeks into our wintering, a storm swept over the ridge, heavy with ice and wind. The snow blew so thickly that the trees vanished in the white blur, and the cold cut through wool and fur as though they were paper. We huddled in the cabin we had built from spruce logs, the fire glowing red in the hearth. The wind roared through the branches like a river of air, shaking loose frozen needles that clattered against the roof. It was the kind of night when even wolves retreat, when the forest closes itself against all living things. It was also the first night we heard the sound. It came late, near the deepest hour of darkness, when the storm had lost some of its fury, but still pressed heavily upon the land. A long, low call rolled across the ridge deep enough to vibrate in the chest, but with a timbre that was not wolf, nor moose, nor any creature known to these woods. It had a strange rise and fall to it, almost like a man calling out from a great distance, but stretched, mournful, and too powerful to be human. It came again after a pause, this time closer. The men looked at each other across the firelight, but no one spoke. The storm howled outside, yet the sound cut through it unmistakably, a deep bellow that seemed to climb the trunks of the pines and settle into the logs of our cabin. A third call sounded farther away again, as though whatever made it was moving along the ridge at great speed. The forest answered with silence. Even the wind seemed to waver. In the morning, after the storm had passed and the world lay buried in new snow, we found the tracks. They circled the cabin widely, keeping just beyond the thinning ring of trees where the forest opened onto the frozen lake. They were the same immense foot-shaped impressions we had seen near the ravine, but more numerous and clearer against the fresh snow. Each step was set with a weight that compressed the snow deeply, forming wells of compacted ice. They moved with a long, unbroken stride, pacing around our camp in a broad arc before disappearing into the woods to the west. The discovery unsettled us profoundly. It meant that while we huddled inside, thinking ourselves sheltered from the worst of the storm, something had walked the perimeter of our camp, inspecting us, circling us, perhaps waiting for some instinct we could not perceive. Men who had trapped these lands for 20 winters grew pale at the sight of those prints. The woods felt suddenly smaller, less forgiving. In the following days, more signs appeared. Trees bearing vertical scrapes far higher than any man could reach. Tufts of coarse dark hair caught on broken branches, and once the twisted remains of a fox whose neck had been snapped cleanly like the moose's. We found no tracks near the fox, as if the creature that killed it had approached without disturbing the snow at all. That absence troubled me more than the presence of the prints themselves. The days grew shorter, the cold sharper. Food grew scarce. The beaver ponds remained oddly quiet, as though emptied. Snowshoe hares rarely appeared, and when they did, their tracks sometimes ended abruptly, not in blood or struggle, but in empty space, suggesting they had been lifted bodily from the ground. The men whispered of forest spirits and old tales told by nations who knew these lands better than we ever would. They spoke of beings who walked between the trees unseen, guardians or hunters of the deep wilderness. But no tale I had ever heard spoke of a presence that left tracks so clear or kills so deliberate. It was near the end of December when the first true disturbance happened. We had set a line of traps along a creek that fed into the lake. The ice there froze unevenly, forming ridges and hollows where the water ran shallow. 3 men went to check the traps before dawn, when the cold was sharpest and the sky faint with early light. They returned with only 1 hare and an expression of deep unease. At the far end of the trap line, they had found the snow disturbed, the traps torn from the ground and flung aside. One had been bent nearly in half, though it was made of iron thick enough to hold a wolf. The men claimed they felt a vibration in the air as they approached, a kind of low thrumming that pulsed through the trees and set their teeth on edge. They had heard nothing else, but all agreed they were being watched. I walked the trap line myself later that morning, carrying my journal and studying every mark as carefully as the cold would allow. The snow told a story I did not wish to read. Tracks large enough to swallow my bootprint whole moved across the creek in long strides. Spruce branches lay broken in strange patterns, bent downward rather than snapped upward as they would be by falling snow or wind. One tree bore an indentation in its trunk, as though a massive shoulder had brushed it. The forest felt inert, holding its breath. That night none of us slept well. The air inside the cabin felt heavy, as if pressing on our lungs. The fire's glow seemed swallowed by the shadows near the corners. Outside, the woods creaked and shifted with sounds that did not belong to wind alone. Once, during the deepest part of the night, I woke to the sensation of something passing close to the cabin wall. The logs seemed to tremble faintly, not from wind, but from a weight brushing against them. I held my breath and listened, but heard nothing more. The weeks that followed were a slow descent into a dread we could not name. The wilderness had always been harsh, but harshness we understood. What we faced that winter defied the logic that kept us alive in these lands. The tracks around our camp became more frequent. Each morning revealed new impressions in the snow, sometimes leading toward us, sometimes circling widely, sometimes stopping abruptly, as if whatever made them had vanished into thin air. We found more carcasses crushed or broken without signs of struggle. And always, it seemed, the forest watched. It was in those days that the sightings began, not full glimpses, but shapes moving between the trees, half seen in the dim winter light. Once, while gathering firewood, one man swore he saw a figure standing among the spruce, a massive silhouette, broader at the shoulders than any man, its posture straight, its arms long. He blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the sway of branches and the sound of snow settling. Though none of us admitted it aloud at the time, many had similar impressions. The sense of being watched became constant, an unshakable truth that settled into our bones. Then came the night when we found the first structure. I had gone outside just before dusk to gather more wood. The sky held a pale, washed-out glow, and the air stung with a biting cold that promised snow before morning. As I approached the tree line, I noticed an odd pattern in the branches ahead, a kind of archway formed by fallen limbs, though none had fallen recently. The branches were arranged deliberately, interwoven with strips of bark and saplings bent to unnatural shapes. It stood taller than a man, narrow at the top and broad at the base, like a crude frame. Snow had settled on it lightly, suggesting it had been built not long before. I approached slowly, studying the way the branches twisted together. Some were wedged so firmly between trunks that they could not have been placed by human hands without tools. The ground beneath the structure was cleared of snow, revealing a bed of pine needles pressed flat by weight. Footprints led away into the deeper woods, the same immense impressions we had seen for weeks. When I returned to camp and described what I had seen, the men fell into an uneasy silence. None wished to go back and see it for themselves. We avoided the tree line that night, staying close to the fire until the cold drove us indoors. In the early morning hours, when the fire had burned down to embers, a sound woke me, a heavy thud, distant but unmistakable, like a footfall falling on frozen earth. It was followed by another, then another, slow and rhythmic, circling our camp. I sat upright, my breath catching in my throat. The cabin was silent, except for the sound of men holding their breath. Outside, the steps continued, pacing around us with deliberate slowness, as though whatever made them was studying us through the dark. Then they stopped directly behind the cabin wall. The logs creaked softly, as though brushed by a hand or shoulder of enormous weight. I do not know how long we sat in silence, waiting for the next step. When morning finally came, the tracks around the cabin formed a near-perfect circle. It was then, for the first time, that I began to understand something had chosen to watch us closely. And whatever it was, it walked on 2 feet. The day after the great circle of tracks appeared around our cabin, none of the men spoke openly of the truth we all understood, yet each moved with a heaviness that revealed more than words ever could. We had lived in the wilderness long enough to recognize ordinary dangers, the crack of a branch signaling a bear's approach, the stillness that announced a pack of wolves nearby, the muffled sound of a lynx stalking snowshoe hares. But what stalked us now was no animal we had ever known. The presence displayed intention. It showed patience. It moved at night when we were least able to defend ourselves, and it circled our dwelling in a way that suggested curiosity tainted by something deeper, something far more deliberate. The air that morning was brittle with cold. Frost rimed the edges of the cabin door and clung to our blankets indoors. When I stepped outside, my breath plumed in great bursts that hung in the air before drifting downward like smoke. The snow reflected the pale winter light, illuminating the tracks that encircled our camp with an eerie clarity. Each print was deep and well-defined, showing the splay of toes and the broad heel, unmistakable as the mark of something walking on 2 feet. The impressions were too large, the stride too long, the sheer weight too immense to belong to any man. I measured one of the prints with my mittened hand laid flat across the snow. My fingertips didn't reach halfway across the width. The depth revealed weight beyond comprehension for any creature of flesh and bone that walked upright. Whatever had passed our cabin in the night had done so with no fear of discovery, no attempt to hide its presence. It had claimed the space around us as its own. The men watched me from the doorway as I studied the tracks. None wished to come closer. I could see in their eyes the discomfort they tried to hide, the dawning understanding that this winter would not be like others we had endured. I returned inside without speaking, and the door closed quickly behind me, shutting out the frigid air and the footprints that had unsettled us so deeply. For the remainder of the morning, the men moved quietly about the cabin, tending to small tasks with a rigidity that betrayed their unease. One mended snowshoes that were not broken. Another cleaned traps that did not need cleaning. A third sorted through our stores of flour and dried peas, as though these mundane actions could restore a sense of normalcy. We were men accustomed to hardship, yet there was something in the way we avoided each other's eyes that spoke of an unspoken agreement. None wished to dwell on the possibility that we were being hunted. Around midday, I gathered my journal and went to check the traps that lay closest to camp. The air was still and so cold it numbed my face within minutes. The forest carried none of its usual sounds, no movement of small animals beneath the branches, no call of birds along the frozen lake. Only the crunch of snow beneath my boots accompanied me. I followed the line of traps along a ridge overlooking a shallow creek, its surface frozen beneath a thin layer of snow. Several traps had been sprung, though nothing remained inside them. The bait was gone without any disturbance to the surrounding snow. Something had taken it with remarkable precision, lifting the trap in such a way that no sign of struggle remained. I found this more unsettling than the broken traps we had discovered earlier. A creature capable of avoiding the mechanism entirely, of taking the bait without triggering the spring, displayed a level of awareness I could not reconcile with any animal I knew. At the end of the trap line, near a cluster of spruce trees that leaned inward like a gathering of dark sentinels, I found another sign. The snow there was disturbed, not in a chaotic way, but in a pattern that suggested deliberate movement. Large footprints moved between the trees, circling each trunk as though the creature had examined them methodically. The branches bore fresh scrapes, long vertical marks that rose far above my head. Dark hair clung to one of the scrapes, coarse and thick, unlike any fur I had encountered. I held it between my fingers for a moment, studying the texture. It was too dense to belong to a bear, too long for wolf or moose, and possessed a strange stiffness that made it seem almost unnatural. As I pocketed the hair to study later, I felt a shift in the air, subtle but distinct, as though something nearby had expelled a slow breath. The forest grew absolutely still. The silence pressed upon me so completely that I felt it in my chest. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, but saw only the stillness of winter and the faint drift of falling snow. Yet I could not shake the sense of being watched. I returned to camp with my heart heavy and my mind clouded by questions I could not articulate. When I shared what I had found with the others, they listened in uneasy silence. No man dismissed my observations, nor did any offer an explanation. The forest's behavior in recent weeks had already eroded our confidence in the safety of our wintering grounds. Each new sign added weight to a conclusion none of us wished to voice. We were not alone. We had never been alone. Something immense and intelligent was moving through the forest around us, tracking our movements, inspecting our tools, pacing our cabin at night. Days passed with little improvement. The temperature plummeted further, forcing us to ration firewood carefully. Each morning brought new signs, more tracks, more scrapes, more disturbances near camp. The creature had begun approaching closer, leaving prints mere steps from the cabin walls. Once, I awoke to find that a pile of firewood I had stacked neatly the previous evening had been scattered across the snow. The tracks that surrounded the pile revealed a path where Bigfoot had inspected each piece before discarding it. There was no sign of aggression in the act, only curiosity, as though the creature sought to understand our habits. We tried to continue our trapping routes as usual, but each venture into the woods brought fresh encounters with the silent signs of Bigfoot's presence. One morning, we found the remnants of a deer carcass near the lake. The animal had been torn open with effortless strength, its ribs cracked as though by an enormous hand. No predator marks marred the flesh. The kill bore the unmistakable signs of Bigfoot's grip-clean breaks, immense pressure, no evidence of teeth. 2 men refused to approach the carcass, their fear overcoming their sense of duty. I recorded the details in my journal with shaking hands. Then came the night that changed the nature of our fears entirely. Up until then, we had heard only the distant calls and the heavy footsteps pacing our boundary. We had seen the aftermath of its presence, but not the creature itself. On this night, that changed. It began with a faint thud against the cabin wall, soft enough that we might have dismissed it as settling wood or the shifting of snow. But the sound came again, this time more distinct, as though something heavy had brushed against the logs. The fire inside flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. Every man sat rigid, listening. Outside, the snow muffled most sounds, but the footsteps, when they came, cut through the cold air with unsettling clarity. Each step landed with a deliberate weight, slow and measured. The ground seemed to tremble beneath it. The steps moved along the side of the cabin, stopping directly beside the window where frost clung thickly to the glass. I felt the air in the cabin grow tight as the men held their breath. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a massive shape moved past the window, blocking what little light filtered through the frost. The outline was unmistakable broad shoulders, a towering frame, and the slow, deliberate movement of something standing fully upright. The men closest to the window shrank back instinctively. I remained still, my eyes fixed on the frost-covered pane, waiting for any further sign. The silhouette lingered, motionless, as though Bigfoot were listening to our faint breaths. Then, with a single stride, it moved away, its footfalls fading into the darkness. The cabin did not ease its hold on us for many minutes after, and none of us spoke until dawn. When morning arrived, the tracks outside showed that Bigfoot had approached within a foot of the cabin wall. The prints extended toward the tree line before vanishing where the snow thinned beneath the boughs. None of the men wanted to follow them. Something in the shape and depth of those impressions created a fear that resisted reason. The weeks that followed saw conditions worsen in every direction. The snow grew deeper, food scarcer, and the presence of Bigfoot more intrusive. The creature began visiting the camp every few nights, leaving new patterns of tracks and occasionally disturbing our belongings. Once, it lifted the corner of the cabin's roof just enough to disturb the snow that had accumulated there. We found the fallen mound of snow inside the cabin in the morning, accompanied by the enormous footprints that trailed away from the wall. It had tested the structure, gauging its strength. Throughout this period, the men's morale dwindled. Even the strongest among us grew pale with lack of sleep and constant dread. We devised plans to relocate our camp, to abandon the lake, and move toward the nearest known trading route, but the snow prevented safe passage. The forest paths were buried, the ice on the lake unpredictable, the distances too great for men weakened by hunger. We were trapped by winter and by the presence of BIGFOOT, which seemed to anticipate our movements and linger near our camp as though waiting. It was during one of the rare calm mornings that we discovered the second structure. This one was larger than the archway I had found earlier. Two trunks bent toward each other and held in place with interwoven branches and strips of bark. Beneath it lay a bed of pine needles arranged with deliberate care. Snow had begun to collect on it, but the pine still held warmth, suggesting the structure had been used recently. The footprints around it were numerous, and several were pressed deeper into the snow, indicating the creature had knelt or rested there. The realization that BIGFOOT built structures with intention, perhaps even used them as resting places or markers, unsettled us in a way no mere sighting could. This was no stray animal, no wandering anomaly. This was a being that shaped its environment with purpose. As winter deepened, the nights grew longer and the cold more biting. The creature's visits became more frequent. We heard its calls at dusk and its footsteps in the early hours of morning. We found fresh kills near our camp, sometimes left intact, sometimes partially crushed, as though BIGFOOT were offering them or leaving them as warnings. The distinction was unclear. Then came the night of the first direct attack. The storm had begun earlier in the evening, a quiet snowfall that grew into a furious barrage of wind-driven ice. The cabin shuddered under the gale, and the fire struggled to maintain its glow. We huddled in our blankets, waiting for the storm to ease, when we heard a tremendous crack outside, like the breaking of a thick branch or the splitting of frozen earth. The sound jolted us upright. Then came another, closer, heavier. The third impact shook the cabin itself. Snow fell from the rafters. The logs strained. Something enormous had struck the wall with the force of a falling tree. The men stared at each other, terror reflecting in their eyes. We could hear footsteps thundering just outside, the snow crunching beneath a weight that defied reason. The creature circled the cabin, testing the walls with heavy blows, as though seeking weakness. The logs creaked, splinters fell. The storm outside masked many sounds, but the deliberate pounding was unmistakable. I felt the cold grip of helplessness that accompanies moments when one understands survival hangs by a thread thinner than any branch. As the storm raged, BIGFOOT struck the cabin again, this time at the door. The wood bowed inward, the hinges groaning. Snow blew through the cracks of the roof, and for a moment I believed the creature intended to tear the cabin apart entirely. Then, as suddenly as it began, the assault ceased. The footsteps receded, the weight diminishing in the snow. The storm carried the sound of its retreat into the darkness, leaving only the howl of wind and the trembling of frightened men behind. In the morning, we saw the damage clearly. The door bore a deep indentation, the size of a massive fist or shoulder. The logs on the west wall had shifted from their notches. The snow around the cabin was trampled in chaotic patterns, the footprints overlapping in a frenzy of movement. Trees near the cabin leaned at strange angles, their lower trunks bearing fresh scrapes. The attack marked a shift in BIGFOOT's behavior. What had begun as observation and pacing had turned into direct confrontation. Its interest in us had changed, though whether driven by curiosity, territoriality, or something beyond our understanding, I cannot say. But that was the day we realized our wintering ground was no longer a place of mere danger. It had become a place of siege, and the forest around us no longer felt vast. It felt inhabited by a presence that understood our limits far better than we understood its own. In the days that followed the assault on the cabin, a pall settled over our small party, the sort of heavy, unspoken dread that changes the posture of a man long before it ever reaches his voice. The memory of the cabin walls trembling under each blow lingered in every glance toward the tree line. Even in daylight, the forest seemed altered, no longer indifferent, no longer simply vast and remote, but aware of us in a way that no wilderness should ever be. We moved through our casks with caution, sharpened by the understanding that Bigfoot was no longer content to observe from a distance. The storm had given it cover to test the limits of our shelter, and the results revealed how fragile our protections truly were. The door, bruised inward by the force of the creature's strike, creaked each time we used it, as though reminding us of the narrow margin by which it had held. The west wall, pushed slightly from its notches, let wind whistle through new cracks. We stuffed them with moss, but the repairs felt like a child's attempt to barricade himself against an approaching tide. The men had grown gaunt from sleepless nights and dwindling rations. After the attack, no one wanted to stray far from the cabin, yet remaining nearby only heightened the awareness that Bigfoot could return at any moment and that we would have no better defense than before. We set about reinforcing the structure as best we could, though we lacked the materials to make any meaningful improvements. The snow lay too deep to transport new logs, and the cold had stiffened the earth so thoroughly that driving new stakes into the ground required nearly an hour's effort for each one. We managed to bolster the door with additional beams cut from a nearby deadfall, but the forest itself seemed to sense our movements. The moment we stepped beyond the clearing, the silence deepened, and the snow muffled our footsteps in a way that made the distance between each man feel treacherous. Tracks occasionally appeared at the edge of our sight, not fresh enough to mark a recent visit, but not old enough to assure us of safety either. It was during these days of uneasy labor that I realized the trees themselves bore more signs of Bigfoot's presence than I had initially understood. Many trunks stood scarred by broad, sweeping marks made by immense hands brushing aside snow or bark as though clearing obstacles from its path. Others bore deeper grooves where Greatfoot had dragged its fingertips vertically along the bark, creating lines so straight and evenly spaced that they carried the unmistakable impression of deliberation. The forest around our cabin was becoming a map of the creature's movements, each marking telling a story of where it had passed and what it had inspected. One morning, after a night during which the wind carried faint echoes of distant calls, I ventured farther than usual along a ridge behind the cabin. I sought traps that lay near an outcrop of stone which offered a clear view of the lake. When I reached the crest, I noticed immediately that the snow had been disturbed more widely than by the mere passage of one creature. Multiple sets of tracks crossed the ridge, some older and partially filled with snow, others fresh enough that their edges still held crisp shapes. The footprints varied slightly in size, though all were larger than those of any man. This discovery unsettled me more deeply than the violent attack on our cabin. It revealed a truth we had not considered. Bigfoot was not solitary. The idea that multiple beings of such size and intelligence might inhabit the forest around us introduced a new magnitude of danger. The ridgeline looked as though it had been used as a vantage point, perhaps repeatedly. The snow bore impressions where heavy forms had stood for extended periods, their weight compressing the surface deeper than casual steps would. The view from the ridge looked down upon our clearing, the cabin smoke rising faintly against the winter sky. Whether they watched us out of curiosity or caution, I could not determine, but the knowledge that we were observed from above added an oppressive weight to the landscape. When I returned to the cabin to share what I had found, the men listened without speaking. Fear had already hollowed them, and this revelation carved the emptiness deeper. We had expected to face the hazards of winter, the scarcity of food, and the threat of predators, but never had we imagined ourselves under the scrutiny of a group of beings that moved through the forest with the same familiarity and confidence with which we walked the floorboards of our shelter. The men's expressions made clear that the presence of multiple Bigfoot altered their understanding of our predicament. It meant that the attack had not been the impulse of a lone creature, but the coordinated act of beings whose intentions remained beyond our understanding. In the days that followed, the forest offered new signs of recent activity. A stand of young saplings near the lake lay flattened in a wide arc, their trunks snapped cleanly in the same direction. Snow around the area had been disturbed in large sweeps, revealing patches of dark soil beneath. Farther along the lakeshore, the remains of a moose lay partially submerged in shallow water. The carcass bore marks similar to those we had seen before, clean breaks and crushing force applied with precision. The tracks leading away from it stirred the snow in deep impressions, suggesting the creature's gait was steady and unhurried, even while carrying or dragging such weight. We tried to ration our food more strictly, reducing our meals to the bare minimum needed for strength. But hunger crept through the cabin with the same persistence as cold. We supplemented our meals with the scant fish we managed to catch through a hole in the ice, though the creature's presence had driven most of the wildlife from the immediate area. Even the wolves had grown scarce, their howls distant and infrequent. The forest was adjusting to Bigfoot's dominance, and we were caught within a territory that was not ours. The longer we remained trapped by winter, the more our fear shifted from the creature itself to the realization that our supplies and our time were running dangerously short. Escape on foot would be suicide in the deep snow. Remaining in the cabin felt increasingly perilous. Each night we wondered whether Bigfoot would return, whether the next blow against the wall would be the one that shattered our meager defense. Sleep came only in brief, uneasy intervals, and even then, the heaviness of dread often woke us before any true rest could take hold. As January deepened, the nights stretched longer, and the cold reached the kind of penetrating chill that turned breath into ice before it left the lips. On one of these nights, after the fire had been reduced to faint embers, and the men had surrendered to a restless quiet, I heard a sound that shattered the fragile stillness. It was a low, resonant thud followed by another, rhythmic and measured. The sound approached slowly, each impact vibrating through the frozen ground and into the cabin's floor. The men stirred, some instinctively clutching blankets tighter, others glancing toward the walls with wide, frightened eyes. The steps moved around the cabin, pausing at the corners as though inspecting the structure again. The faint crunch of snow as it shifted weight sent a tremor through every man. Then, with a suddenness that froze my breath, the sound stopped. Silence pressed against the walls with suffocating intensity. For a moment, I wondered whether the creature had retreated. Then came a heavy exhale, so close it sounded as though it were pressed directly against the wood. Frost shook loose from the logs. The men stiffened. The exhale was followed by a deep, guttural rumble that vibrated the rafters. It was not a call like those we had heard from a distance. This was something different, something felt as much as heard, a low resonance that seemed to emanate from within the creature's chest. I sensed in that moment that Bigfoot was not simply inspecting our shelter. It was communicating either with us or with others nearby. The thought that more Bigfoot might be standing unseen in the darkness around us sent fear coursing through my veins. The possibility of multiple creatures coordinating their presence around our fragile shelter made our predicament feel increasingly hopeless. The sound ceased abruptly, replaced by the faint shifting of snow as the creature moved away from the wall. Its footsteps receded slowly, growing fainter until the night reclaimed them entirely. When dawn broke, the men found new tracks around the cabin, more numerous than the previous day. Several sets of footprints overlapped one another, revealing that multiple creatures had approached during the night. The weight of this evidence pressed heavily upon us. We were no longer facing a solitary presence, but a group of beings whose intentions remained beyond our comprehension. Despite our efforts to remain vigilant, fatigue gnawed at our senses. Hunger weakened our limbs, and the constant strain of fear dulled our thoughts. It was during this period of growing vulnerability that the forest delivered another one that forced us to reconsider not only our safety but the nature of our relationship to Bigfoot. While checking the perimeter one morning, I discovered a pile of branches arranged with strange precision near the tree line. At first, I assumed it was the remains of a fallen limb, but the more I studied the arrangement, the more it became apparent that the structure had been assembled intentionally. The branches were of uniform length and placed parallel to one another, forming a shape reminiscent of a crude platform. Atop the branches lay a collection of smooth stones and pieces of bark, all arranged in a deliberate pattern. The meaning of the structure eluded me, yet the care with which it had been assembled was unmistakable. Whether it was a territorial marker, a form of communication, or something entirely beyond our understanding, I could not say. What troubled me most was the presence of fresh tracks leading from the structure toward our cabin. The creature or creatures had not only approached our shelter, but left a sign within sight of our clearing. The winter sun drifted across the sky with slow, indifferent progress. We worked in a haze of exhaustion, managing only the barest tasks necessary for survival. The fire consumed our remaining wood faster than we could replenish it, and the cold crept into our bones with relentless persistence. Yet despite the hardship, the forest remained the greater threat. Bigfoot's presence loomed constantly, its movements unpredictable, but always near. Then came the morning when the tracks revealed something entirely new. We found prints that did not align with any we had seen before. Smaller than the enormous tracks that circled our cabin, yet still far larger than a man's, these impressions traveled alongside the larger ones in a pattern that suggested companionship. The idea that these beings moved in familial groups, that their interactions might extend beyond solitary behavior, intensified the sense of unease among the men. If Bigfoot lived and moved in groups, then our presence in their territory threatened more than our own safety. We had trespassed unknowingly into a domain governed by beings whose internal order we did not understand. We had become witnesses to a world that had existed long before our arrival and would continue long after we were gone. The revelation altered the air inside the cabin. Men avoided the windows, reluctant to see the tracks that marked the creature's passage. The fire cast uneasy shadows on the walls, and even the sound of wind against the roof seemed charged with intent. Each night, I found myself listening not only for the footsteps or calls of Bigfoot, but for the quieter signs of its presence, the shift of branches, the faint rustle of snow disturbed by something moving unseen. The days stretched on, blending into nights punctuated by unfamiliar sounds and the constant fear that any moment might bring another attack. The snow deepened to the point where movement beyond the clearing became nearly impossible. We were confined not only by the cold, but by the knowledge that Bigfoot moved freely through the forest in ways we could never imitate. Its tracks appeared in places we could not reach without great struggle, as though it traversed the terrain with an ease that defied its immense size. Then, during one of the coldest nights of the season, when the cabin walls creaked under the pressure of frozen air, we heard a sound unlike any we had experienced. It was a distant but unmistakable roar, rolling across the treetops with a force that made the floorboards tremble. The roar was deeper and more resonant than any call we had heard before, carrying with it an ancient quality that suggested communication rather than aggression. Moments later, another roar answered from a different part of the forest, echoing faintly before fading into the night. The men sat rigid in their bunks, eyes wide, breaths shallow. The calls were not random. They conveyed structure, timing, perhaps even meaning. Whatever message passed between the creatures, it underscored a truth we had long suspected but avoided acknowledging. Bigfoot possessed a form of communication as complex as any used by animals of higher intelligence. The roars ceased, leaving the night in heavy silence. I lay awake, staring at the dark beams of the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that we were being observed, not as trespassers, but as entities to be understood. The forest held secrets far older than our presence, and Bigfoot was one of them. As dawn approached, the cabin felt smaller than ever, the walls closing in with the weight of fear and uncertainty. I knew that our time in this wilderness was approaching a critical point. We could not endure another attack. Our supplies dwindled. Our strength waned. The presence of multiple Bigfoot surrounding our camp made escape seem impossible. And yet remaining meant slow surrender to hunger and cold. That morning, as the light broke faintly across the clearing, I stepped outside and found new tracks leading directly toward the cabin's door. The prints were enormous, each step packed deep into the snow. They stopped mere inches from the threshold before turning away. The creature had approached so closely that I could see where snow had been brushed aside by its massive legs. The proximity sent a chill deeper than any cold wind could. The fact that Bigfoot had come to our very doorstep without attempting to break through made its intentions more enigmatic. It was watching us, evaluating us, possibly questioning whether we posed a threat. It had shown restraint before, only attacking when spurred by curiosity or opportunity. But each new sign suggested that this restraint had limits. We were nearing the point where the forest would no longer tolerate our presence. And deep down, I sensed that the worst had yet to come. The presence of those tracks at our doorstep stayed with me throughout the hours that followed, accompanying each breath like a second, colder pulse. Even after the men emerged from the cabin one by one, their faces pinched from another restless night, none dared step near the prints until the light had strengthened enough to soften the dread that clung to them. To see the immense impression so close to where we slept so near that only a single thin layer of timber had separated us from the creature proved once more how easily Bigfoot could have shattered our fragile refuge had it chosen to. Its restraint offered no comfort, for the intention behind its actions remained concealed. The knowledge that it had stood within arm's reach of us while we slept left a heaviness more suffocating than the cold. As the day progressed, we moved with a weariness that felt permanent. Snow continued to fall in slow, drifting patterns, settling atop previous layers until the clearing took on a uniform whiteness, broken only by the dark lines of the cabin and the massive tracks that led to and away from it. Our thoughts, already burdened by scarcity and fear, now circled around the unsettling understanding that Bigfoot possessed a curiosity that grew bolder with each passing night. Though the creature had not attacked again, the frequency of its visits increased, as though it were measuring us, perhaps even waiting for some moment to act. The forest, too, began shifting in ways we could not define. Sounds traveled strangely. Familiar calls of birds seemed muted or misplaced, while distant echoes carried a quality that suggested movement larger than any ordinary animal. The men spoke little, their breaths visible in the cold, their eyes flicking toward the tree line with every faint noise. Even routine tasks, such as breaking ice for water or tending to the fire, became moments of tension. Every sound met with stiffened backs and wary glances. One afternoon, while searching for fallen branches to replenish our diminishing supply of firewood, I ventured farther along the edge of the forest than I usually dared. The snow lay deep and uneven, and every step required deliberate placement to avoid sinking waist-deep into drifts. A scattering of ravens circled overhead, their calls sharp and repetitive, as though marking something unseen. When I reached a slight rise beyond the clearing, I saw what had drawn their attention. A deer carcass lying half submerged in a mound of disturbed snow, its body broken in a manner identical to the moose we had discovered earlier in the season. The carcass fascinated and unsettled me at once. There were no teeth marks, no signs that wolves or wolverines had torn at the carcass. Instead, the rib cage had been compressed inward with clean, brutal force. Snow around it bore deep divots where immense hands had gripped and shifted the animal. Tracks leading away from the carcass moved toward the north, the same direction in which we had often heard distant calls echoing through the trees. When I returned to camp and relayed what I had seen, the men's faces reflected both fear and resignation. We had long known that Bigfoot hunted with a strength unmatched by any creature we knew, yet witnessing its efficiency so close to our shelter felt like a reminder that our presence existed only at its tolerance. Over the next days, the forest continued to reveal more signs that Bigfoot and its group remained active around our encampment. I discovered fresh bark markings on several trees near the frozen river, long vertical streaks left by the creature's fingers. Snow revealed tracks from multiple individuals, their prints overlapping in ways that suggested deliberate movement rather than random wandering. Some impressions were smaller, confirming what we suspected earlier. Bigfoot did not travel alone, but in a family group or perhaps a structured community whose boundaries we could not perceive. This realization deepened our unease. We were no longer dealing with a single entity, but an entire presence woven into the wilderness around us. And as winter's grip tightened, making escape impossible, the knowledge that a collective intelligence circled our cabin gnawed at the edges of our resolve. One night, as wind pressed against the walls and snow drummed softly on the roof, another sound rose beneath the storm. It began faintly, a rhythmic tapping reminiscent of a large stick striking frozen earth. The interval between each strike was steady, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The men rose in their bunks, holding their breath as the tapping grew louder. It was not the frantic pattern of some animal moving through the brush, but a slow, consistent beat that carried intent. The sound circled the cabin in a wide arc, stopping occasionally before resuming. Then, from deeper within the forest, another tapping answered, its cadence slightly different, but clearly connected. The exchange continued for several minutes, echoing through the tree line with a resonance that traveled far deeper than the wind. I understood then that this was communication Bigfoot speaking to another beyond our sight. Whether naming our location, signaling our presence, or sending some message unrelated to us, I could not guess. But the realization that these beings employed forms of communication distinct from vocal calls suggested intelligence far surpassing what we initially believed. The sounds ceased eventually, but the unease they left behind lingered long after the storm quieted. When morning came, we found fresh tracks around the cabin once more. The prints overlapped in such a pattern that it took time to decipher the number of creatures that had approached. At least two had moved between the trees, pacing the perimeter with patient, deliberate steps. Their tracks extended toward the frozen river, where the snow had been disturbed in a wide radius. Curiosity drove me to follow the tracks farther along the riverbank. Despite the biting wind and the strain of trudging through deep snow, I pressed on until the tracks converged at a spot where the ice had been broken in a clean circle nearly 6 feet across. Surrounding the hole, the ice bore marks where massive hands had gripped its edges and torn it apart. The water beneath lay dark and still, cold enough to kill a man in minutes. The purpose of this opening remained unclear. Whether Bigfoot hunted fish there, marked territory, or performed some action we could not comprehend, the sight of such immense force exerted so precisely left me with a deeper understanding of how thoroughly the creatures commanded their environment. Unlike us, they did not struggle against winter. They moved through it with ease. Returning to camp after this discovery, I saw the men huddled closer together, their breath thick in the cold air. The fire sputtered as they fed it small sticks of wood. They looked to me as though hoping I carried news that would lighten our burden, but the truth I had witnessed offered no such comfort. I told them only that the creatures remained active near the river, withholding details I felt might push their spirits beyond recovery. As the days progressed, hunger sharpened into a relentless ache. Our supplies had dwindled to a fraction of what we needed, and the cold drained energy at an alarming rate. The men's faces grew hollow, their eyes shadowed. Even the small tasks of tending the fire or securing the door felt monumental. Yet despite our desperation, venturing farther into the forest for food remained unthinkable. The creature's tracks appeared in every direction, forming an invisible boundary that none dared cross. Then, during a morning patrol of the clearing's edge, I found another structure, unlike the earlier arrangement of branches. This one consisted of 3 vertical logs driven into the snow in a triangular formation. At the center lay a stone, smooth and unnaturally round, with lines scored into its surface in a pattern that seemed deliberately crafted. The structure stood at the exact point where the tree line met the clearing, as though marking the boundary between our space and theirs. The men gathered around it silently. No one touched the logs or the stone. These were not random markings, but a message of some kind. Whether it was a warning, a claim, or something else, none of us possessed the understanding to interpret it. By now, our fear had changed shape. It was no longer simply a terror of being attacked or of freezing in the night. It had become a deeper, more suffocating realization that we stood within the territory of beings whose motives remained entirely unknown. Our actions, movements, and even our attempts at survival were observed by creatures that seemed to understand us better than we understood them. The weather worsened as January drew to a close. Snowstorms followed one another with little respite, burying our traps and blocking familiar paths. Each passing day left the forest more silent, as though the cold had muted all other life. Only the occasional distant roars of Bigfoot broke the stillness, their calls drifting over the treetops like echoes from another world. One night, as we lay awake in our bunks listening to the creaking of the cabin beneath the cold, we heard a faint scraping against the wall. The sound was subtle at first, barely audible above the wind. But slowly it grew louder, moving along the logs in a slow, deliberate line. The pattern resembled what I had witnessed in the forest, the gentle brushing of enormous fingers across bark. The creature was exploring the structure again, testing it, perhaps evaluating its strength. The scraping stopped abruptly, followed by a deep breath that condensed against the outer wall. Frost dripped from between the logs, with the warm air of the cabin at the cold breath from outside. The creature remained still for several long moments before stepping away. Each step sank deep into the snow, leaving tremors that vibrated through the cabin floorboards. When morning came, the tracks revealed that Bigfoot had circled the cabin multiple times during the night, pausing at each wall and window. Its impressions overlapped with smaller sets of tracks, confirming once more that the creature did not travel alone. The realization that multiple beings had approached our shelter in the darkness left the men pale and silent. It was after this night that the idea of leaving the cabin began to surface among the men. Despite the deadly cold and deep snow, remaining in the clearing had become increasingly perilous. Our presence seemed to provoke more frequent visits, each one edging closer to an inevitable confrontation. If we stayed, we risked death by hunger, cold, or the creature's next attack. If we attempted to flee, we risked exposure and exhaustion in the unforgiving wilderness. The choice weighed heavily on us, but as our food dwindled to almost nothing, we understood that staying in place offered no hope. The forest had given us warning after warning, and we had reached the limits of what the cabin could provide. We needed to move, to seek a larger settlement, or at least a safer stretch of land where Bigfoot's presence might be less concentrated. The days leading up to our decision were marked by new signs that we no longer held even the illusion of safety. While collecting firewood near the tree line, one of the men discovered a fresh footprint partially filled with melting snow. The print had been made no more than an hour before. Snowflakes continued to fall, but the tracks remained sharp enough to confirm that Bigfoot still moved close by, even in daylight. The realization that the creature watched us at all hours shattered the last remnants of composure among the men. Their hands shook as they worked. Their breaths came in shallow bursts. They spoke in whispers, as though raising their voices might summon the creatures from the forest. On the evening before we planned to depart, I stepped outside to gather a final measure of snow for melting. The air felt unnaturally still, and the silence pressed against my ears in a way that made my heartbeat sound louder than my footsteps. As I moved toward the snowbank, I sensed a presence before I saw it. The hairs along my neck rose, and my breath froze halfway between lungs and lips. Then, from the tree line, a figure emerged. Bigfoot stepped into the clearing with a confidence that left no doubt of its dominance. Its immense form towered above the snow, broad shoulders rising and falling with each breath. Its fur, matted with ice, glistened faintly under the pale moonlight. It stood still, watching me with an expression impossible to decipher, neither rage nor fear, but something deeper, something that seemed to weigh my existence in its vast, ancient world. For several long moments, neither of us moved. A heavy calm enveloped the clearing, broken only by the soft crackle of the cabin's fire leaking faintly through the walls behind me. The creature's breath rose in slow clouds that drifted upward and vanished. It tilted its head slightly, as though observing me with an intelligence that felt almost human. I remained rooted in place, unable to step forward or retreat. The creature stood no more than 30 paces away, its presence overwhelming in a way that cannot be captured by description alone. The air around it felt charged, as though the forest itself leaned toward the clearing in anticipation. Then, without warning, Bigfoot turned silently and disappeared back into the trees. No sound accompanied its departure. No branches snapped. No snow shifted. It simply vanished, leaving behind an imprint in the clearing that would forever remain in my memory. When I returned to the cabin and told the men what I had seen, they understood immediately that our time in the clearing had reached its end. Bigfoot had revealed itself openly, without aggression, but with unmistakable intent. Whatever its purpose, remaining in the cabin became unthinkable. We prepared to leave at dawn, but the forest had one final lesson to offer us before the sun could rise. We rose before dawn, though none of us had slept. The cabin smelled of cold ash and damp wool, and the stillness inside felt heavier than the walls themselves. Each man moved with a cautious purpose, gathering what little remained of our supplies. The food amounted to little more than a few handfuls of dried meat and a small pouch of coarse flour that we planned to mix with melted snow. The ropes, tools, and flints were bundled together in a single pack, tied so tightly that the frozen fibers creaked under the strain. We prepared ourselves as though we were setting out into an unfamiliar world, for in many ways we were. The sky held a faint grayness when we stepped outside. The clearing lay silent beneath a smooth sheet of snow, untouched except for the lingering tracks from the night before, those enormous impressions leading to and away from our door. The sight of them reminded us of the encounter I had lived only hours earlier, when Bigfoot emerged from the tree line with a calm and deliberate presence. The memory returned unbidden, vivid as though it had carved itself into the cold air. I felt that the creature's appearance had not been a threat, but a warning nonetheless. And it had been enough to urge us from the cabin before winter or fear consumed us entirely. We carried only what we could bear. The furs we wore offered little protection from the cold that awaited us, but we had no choice. Remaining would mean starvation, or another confrontation with creatures whose intentions we still could not understand. We slung the packs over our shoulders, clasped our coats tightly, and stepped out into the forest with the brittle determination of men who no longer believed they controlled their fate. The forest greeted us with the same oppressive quiet we had grown accustomed to. The snow swallowed our footsteps, and the air hung still as if waiting to reveal some hidden truth. Each tree stood shrouded in white, their branches sagging under the weight. The narrow path we carved through the snow wound between them like a fragile thread that might break at any moment. We followed the river south, hoping the terrain would eventually grow gentler and that signs of other trappers or indigenous families might appear along the way. At first, our movement warmed our limbs and gave us a fleeting sense of progress. The sun pushed weakly through the clouds, offering enough light to navigate by. But within an hour, the snow deepened, rising nearly to our knees in some places, and the pace slowed to a crawl. The cold seeped through our boots, numbing our toes, and the strain of pushing through the drifts left our breath sharp and ragged. Yet we pressed forward, driven by the knowledge that the creatures had allowed us to leave. So long as we advanced steadily, we believed we might move beyond their territory. But even this belief felt fragile, for the forest carried signs that Bigfoot remained near. Fresh tracks occasionally appeared along our path, always a few paces from where we walked, never directly blocking our way. The impressions were deep, too deep for new snow to obscure. They marked a parallel route, as though the creatures traveled alongside us in silence, watching our progress without intervening. At one point, when we paused to catch our breath near a cluster of spruce trees, one of the men pointed wordlessly toward the ridge above us. There, partially obscured by branches, stood a figure with the unmistakable silhouette of Bigfoot. Its massive shoulders and thick fur blended into the dark boughs, but there was no mistaking its size or posture. It remained absolutely still, watching us with a patience that unnerved even the bravest among us. After a moment, the creature stepped backward and vanished without disturbing a single branch. We resumed our march with renewed tension, sensing that we were not merely leaving the territory, but being escorted away from it. The forest seemed to guide us, its paths narrowing and widening as though shaped by forces older than memory. Fallen trees appeared in deliberate patterns, and the wind shifted in unnatural ways, carrying faint sounds that resonated deeper than ordinary animal calls. Once, when the wind dropped entirely, we heard the distant tapping again, the rhythmic beat of wood on wood, though it was impossible to tell how far away the sound originated. As the day wore on, the sky darkened prematurely. A storm gathered above the treetops, shifting the air with the heaviness that always precedes snowfall. We quickened our pace, knowing that travel would become impossible if the snow deepened further. Hunger gnawed at us, and exhaustion threatened to slow our movement to a standstill. But fear pushed us onward, fear of the creatures, and fear of remaining exposed in such a vast and unknown wilderness. By late afternoon, we reached a stretch of the river where the ice had fractured into uneven slabs, leaving narrow channels of dark water visible between them. The sight reminded us of the opening Bigfoot had created earlier in the season when hunting or marking the territory. The men exchanged uneasy glances, but we continued along the bank, careful to avoid the unstable edges. As we advanced, I noticed that the ice bore long scratches in several places, marks too symmetrical to be caused by mere shifting or expansion. The grooves ran parallel to the shore, as though made by enormous hands dragging along the surface. Near dusk, when the light dimmed to a pale twilight, we heard a low, resonant call echo through the forest. It came from behind us, stretching across the treetops with a depth that carried both strength and distance. Another call answered from farther north, followed by a third from somewhere beyond the ridge. The men froze where they stood, listening as the calls passed between the creatures like a message relayed across the wilderness. Whether the calls signaled our departure or warned others of our presence, we could not know. But the exchange carried a structure unmistakable in its precision. The storm began just as we found a cluster of fallen logs that offered a semblance of shelter. We cleared the snow between them and set a small fire, though the flames offered little warmth against the biting wind. The smoke drifted upward and disappeared into the darkness. The men huddled together around the fire, their exhaustion visible in their hollow expressions. We ate a small handful of dried meat, though it did little to ease our hunger. The cold pressed into our bones, heavy and relentless. I attempted to rest, but found my thoughts returning again and again to the creature I had seen the night before. Bigfoot standing in the clearing with its calm, deliberate gaze. The image held a quiet power that unsettled me more deeply than any roar or distant call. It had watched me not with malice, but with awareness, as though weighing something in its ancient understanding. I wondered whether it sensed that our departure was driven by necessity rather than anger or defiance. Perhaps it recognized our weakness and chose to allow us to leave rather than provoke a confrontation whose outcome might benefit none. The storm strengthened through the night, burying our tracks and forcing us to remain sheltered among the logs until dawn. When morning came, the forest stood transformed into a landscape of white, its silence so complete that even our breathing seemed too loud. We trudged onward, following the faint outline of the river, though our progress slowed with every passing hour. The snow rose nearly to our thighs in some places, and the wind hardened its surface into crusts that shattered under our weight. As we pressed deeper south, the signs of Bigfoot grew less frequent. The tracks that had shadowed us for so long became sporadic, then disappeared altogether. The forest regained some measure of its earlier quiet, still vast and indifferent, but no longer charged with the presence of beings that moved beyond our understanding. The absence of the creatures should have brought relief, but instead it carried a strange, hollow feeling. For weeks, our survival had been tied to their movements, their choices, their enigmatic intentions. Without their presence, the forest felt unfamiliar, as though we had stepped from one world into another without crossing any visible boundary. Eventually, the trees thinned, and the land sloped gently downward. The river widened, its frozen surface smoother and less disturbed by deep imprints. By midday, we encountered tracks not of Bigfoot, but of wolves, their patterns familiar and almost comforting after so many weeks of facing the unknown. The sight of them brought a cautious hope that we were nearing regions more frequented by ordinary wildlife and perhaps by humans as well. We continued south for 2 more days, guided primarily by the river and the faint warmth of the sun that occasionally broke through the clouds. Hunger became a constant ache, and our limbs trembled from the endless strain of trudging through snow. Yet our determination to survive outweighed every hardship. We rested only when absolutely necessary, and resumed our march with the rising sun. On the 3rd day, shortly before dusk, we reached a clearing cut by an older trail. The ground bore marks of human passage, snow flattened by sled runners, footprints made by people rather than creatures. The sight struck us with such force that a few of the men sank to their knees in the snow, overwhelmed by relief. We followed the trail until smoke from a distant cabin drifted faintly through the trees. The scent of wood and cooking brought tears to our eyes. The family that lived in the cabin received us with caution at first, for we were a ragged and desperate sight. But when they saw our condition, starved, frostbitten, and trembling, they offered food and shelter without hesitation. The warmth of the fire and the taste of fresh broth restored a measure of strength we thought lost forever. Yet even as we rested, the memory of what we had witnessed clung to us like a second skin. The family listened to our account with expressions that shifted between skepticism and silent understanding. They spoke of strange sightings in the northern woods, distant roars carried by the wind, and footprints found during hunting trips that defied explanation. Though they had never encountered Bigfoot directly, they recognized the wilderness as a place far older and more complex than the map suggested. When at last we continued our journey to the nearest settlement, the weight of our experience remained with us. Some among the men vowed never to return to the northern forests, while others wrestled with a quiet curiosity that bordered on fascination. As for me, I documented everything in my journal, knowing that future readers might dismiss my words as superstition or madness. Yet I wrote with clarity and precision, seeking to preserve not only the events, but the emotions that shaped them. I described the creature's immense size, its strength, its markings on trees, its communication through calls and tapping, its restraint, and its intelligence. I wrote of the tracks that shadowed us, the structures left near our clearing, the pressures in the air that signaled the creature's presence. I recounted its appearance in the moonlit clearing, the calm awareness in its posture, and the silent way it moved through the forest. These entries became not only a record, but a testament to a world that exists beyond the edges of our understanding. In the weeks that followed, as we regained our strength and re-entered the routines of daily life, the memory of those winter nights in the northern wilderness remained sharp. I often found myself waking in the early hours before dawn, listening for distant sounds that never came. The forest had imprinted itself upon me, leaving a presence that lingered long after the danger had passed. Bigfoot did not pursue us beyond its territory, nor did it attempt to harm us once we had chosen to leave. Whether this restraint was born of wisdom, territorial instinct, or some deeper intelligence, I cannot say. But I know that we survived not because of our strength or skill, but because the creatures allowed us to. And sometimes at night, when the wind moves through the trees in a certain way, I hear faint echoes that resemble those rhythmic calls or the soft tapping that first drew our attention. On those nights, I remember the silent presence in the moonlight, the enormous figure standing at the edge of the clearing, and the knowledge that the wilderness holds truths far beyond our reach. I know now that the forest north of the river belongs not to men. It never has.